From 1878 to 1968, there were 71 lake captains that called Bayview, Wisconsin, on the shore of Lake Michigan, their home. While they lived here, they captained 195 different ships, from tugboats to schooners to steamships, in voyages that took them to every one of the Great Lakes. Join us now for another episode of Bayview, Town of Lake Captains, where we explore not only these captains, but also their ships, their homes, their families, and their lifetime of sailing adventures on the Great Lakes.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Bayview, Town of Lake Captains, where we talk about 71 different lake captains that lived in Bayview between 1878 and 1968. And this video is sponsored by the Historic Bayview Lake Captains Society. Today I'm standing in front of the former home of Captain George Thompson. Now, George Thompson lived in Bayview for about 6 years. A couple different homes, one over on Alice Street, this one here on East Lincoln Avenue. But before he came to Bayview and after, he had a substantial and significant Great Lakes maritime background as a lake captain. Now, I mentioned his home on Alice Street. What happened there was he was a lake captain and he brought his ship into Milwaukee Harbor as they were approaching the grain silo to dock. Somehow the engine telegraph signals got mixed up from, I don't know, ahead slow or back slow to full ahead. And by the time they detected it, the propellers had already spun up, and a huge ship like that, this big steamship, doesn't just stop on a dime. And they ended up slamming into essentially the grain silo, huge building ashore right next to the pier, and it turned it on its foundation. It bent it like 30 degrees, but it didn't go down. It stayed there. So it looked like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. People came from all over the Midwest to sketch it for newspapers and things. That happened on Alice Street. So, like, I would normally have made that the house that I would have filmed in front of, but I chose this vacant lot without a house because this event is more significant in my opinion. What happened here is he was on a ship sailing from Milwaukee over to Michigan and hit a bad storm, and the ship wrecked, blown ashore onto a sandbank or something similar, and the waves started smashing it. And once that starts happening, your hours are numbered, and they need to evacuate the ship. And so the US Lifesaving Service, the predecessor to the Coast Guard, brought in their Breeches Buoy rescue system, which will be talked about in the video, and they rescued George, all the passengers that they had aboard, and George Thompson, the captain, last. And then right before him, evacuated on the Breeches Buoy, was Stephen Brownell, who was his first or second mate and a future Bayview Lake captain. So he and a future Bayview Lake captain both rescued via the legendary Breeches Buoy, one of a few Bayview Lake captains to have experienced that, and that's pretty significant. So I'll let Simon Stanhope tell you the rest of it, but for right now, that's the brief introduction to George Thompson. Tremendous sailor, tremendous captain, lots of experience, mostly steamships. I think all steamships, actually. Many he captained. Oh, one more thing I forgot. Before he came to Bayview, he was selected to be the captain of a steamship that was going to be, on 24 hours notice, was built to be converted over into a gunboat to fight the British in case they came back like the War of 1812 again. I'm not making that up. So you can really say that George Thompson was a gunboat captain on the Great Lakes, technically. Amazing. So that will all be discussed in detail on the video coming up. Enjoy it. And with that, I'll say hats off to Bayview's Lake Captains, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.
Welcome to another installment of Bayview, Town of Lake Captains, where we discuss the lives of the 71 different lake captains that once lived in Bayview, Wisconsin, during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in the age of sail and steam. This discussion will include their ships, their homes, their families, and their lifetime of sailing adventures on the Great Lakes. Here is the map of lake captains' homes in Bayview, to show you where this episode takes place. Its location focuses primarily on the large green arrow. Today we will be discussing the life of Captain George L. Thompson, who is the only documented Bayview Lake captain to have been rescued by the US Lifesaving Service using its legendary late 19th and early 20th century rescue system known as the Breeches Buoy. A photo exists that was taken of that rescue as it was underway. He lived on East Lincoln Avenue at the time. Captain Thompson is also another part of Great Lakes history. In the late 19th century, when Canada and Britain proposed reintroducing armed ships into the Great Lakes, George Thompson was selected to captain a car ferry that had been subsequently designed and built to be converted in 24 hours to a gunboat as a response. He is one of the few Great Lakes captains to ever captain such a ship, and certainly the only Bayview Lake captain that ever did. Altogether, in his over 30 years sailing on the lakes, before, during, and after he lived in Bayview, George Thompson captained 7 and possibly 8 different ships. Before he became a captain, he crewed another 9. Captain George L. Thompson was born in October 1859 in New York. His parents were both born in Scotland. It's unknown if he had any siblings. Upon turning 18 in the year 1877, he appears to have moved to Canada, likely directly across from Detroit in Windsor, Canada, and taken his first job as a watchman on the steamship Quebec, owned by the Northwestern Transportation Company of the Canadian Royal Mail Line that had offices in both Detroit and Windsor. He was residing in Canada when he was married in 1881. He then moved to Michigan in 1882, and likely remained there for the next 15 years, through 1897. What follows next are his early ships and dates from his pre-Wisconsin and pre-Bayview days. This documentation is one of the most detailed, especially for pre-Bayview early sailing days, of any Bayview lake captain. Note these first ships show his beginnings as a crewman before moving up to captain. Crew records that survive today are less common than for captains, but for George Thompson, these crew records are comprehensive and provide a very detailed chronological sailing record for him. So, here are his early ships before coming to Bayview, with the ship's name followed by his position aboard. 1877 to 79, the steamship Quebec, watchman 1877, wheelsman 1878, second mate 1879. 1880 to 81, the schooner Seaman. 1882, the steamship Northerner, wheelsman. 1883, the steamship Horace B. Tuttle, wheelsman. 1883, the steamship Iron Age, wheelsman. 1884, the steamship Milwaukee, wheelsman. 1885, the steamship Algoma, crew, his position aboard possibly newsboy. 1885 to 87, the steamship Fountain City, wheelsman, second mate, first mate. 1888 to 91, the steamship Colorado, second mate, first mate, captain. 1891 to 92, the steamship Osceola, captain. 1893, steamship Roanoke, captain. 1893 to 94, the car ferry Ann Arbor No. 1, captain. 1894, the steamship George W. Johnson, captain. 1895, the steamship Rhoda Emily, captain. 1896, the steamship George W. Caldwell, captain. 1897, car ferry Shenango No. 2, captain. Two details about these ships are of particular interest. The first is regarding the car ferry Ann Arbor No. 1, of which George Thompson was captain from 1893 to 94, again before he came to Bayview. This car ferry was designed and purpose-built specifically to be able to be converted in just 24 hours into, wait for it, a gunboat. This concept and design occurred in response to the proposed new construction of armed revenue cutters to be built by Canada with British support. The American construction and conversion plan was done with US Navy assistance and with the support of President Benjamin Harrison. The superstructure was built so it could be removed in a matter of hours, with a gun turret to be placed near the stern, also known as the back of the ship. The bow, or front of the ship, was strengthened to both break ice and to ram other ships during war. While the actual conversion was never needed, and thus never happened, the ship was in fact successfully built for it. Therefore, George Thompson was the only Bayview Lake captain that had ever, during his career, been in command of such a ship. The second item of particular interest regarding the aforementioned pre-Bayview ships connected with George Thompson is that the Shenango No. 2, of which George first became captain in 1897, had been built by its Canadian owners for use on Lake Erie and for voyages to Chicago and back. Their subsequent leasing and sale of it to the Chicago and West Michigan Railroad Company, which planned to use it as a railroad car ferry on Lake Michigan between Milwaukee and Muskegon, appears to have been what brought George Thompson, its captain at the time, to Milwaukee and Bayview. As a result of this ship transaction, Captain George L. Thompson appeared in Bayview for the first time in 1897, at aged 40, living at 2254 South Alice Street, working as a captain. It was also his first recorded Wisconsin address. 3 years later, in 1900, He lived at 2046 to 2051 Hilbert Street, adjoining Bay Street, though the specific address number in this range is unclear. Then, in 1901, he moved to 447 East Lincoln Avenue. He would captain only one ship during this entire time of his residency in Bayview, 1897 to 1902, though, amazingly, this ship was to have its name changed 3 times during this period. The first name was the car ferry Shenango No. 2, which he captained from 1st January to 8th December 1898. The second name was the Muskegon, which he captained from 9th December 1898 to 8th October 1901. And the third name was the Père Marquette No. 16, which he captained from 9th October 1901 through 1906, though he left Bayview in 1902. One of Captain Thompson's most notorious sailing adventures occurred when he was entering Milwaukee's harbour as captain of the car ferry Shenango No. 2 on 20th October 1898. In this adventure, he ended up creating, by accident, Milwaukee's very own Leaning Tower of Pisa. Here's what happened. Either because of miscommunications between the bridge and the engine room, or because of a malfunctioning engine telegraph system, the Shenango No. 2 proceeded forward when it should have reversed. In doing so, it accidentally rammed the tall grain elevator belonging to the American Malting Company. The force of the collision was so strong that it bent the elevator 30 degrees on its foundation. It remained standing, but was now permanently leaning, and looked like the famous Leaning Tower of Pisa in Italy. Artists and photographers from around the Great Lakes came to sketch the unique new structure for their newspapers. Captain Thompson lived in Bayview at 2254 South Alice Street at the time of this accident. But Captain Thompson's sailing adventures didn't end there. 3 years later, on 22nd December 1901, less than 2 months after the third name change for the Shenango No. 2 from Muskegon to Père Marquette No. 16, on 9th October, Captain George Thompson of the Père Marquette No. 16 became the only Bayview Lake captain ever documented to have been rescued from a sinking ship by the US Lifesaving Service's legendary Breeches Buoy rescue system. The need for the rescue occurred when the ship ran aground, attempting to enter port at Ludington, Michigan, during a huge gale. Damaged below the waterline, and taking water while being smashed by the waves, the passengers and crew needed to be rescued and taken off the ship. Fortunately, the ship was close enough to shore that the US lifesaving crew at Ludington could set up its Breeches Buoy apparatus on the pier to haul the people off. This worked successfully, and after all the passengers were evacuated, it was time for the ship's crew, and lastly, its officers, to be evacuated. One of these officers rescued by the buoy was Stephen Brownell, the ship's second mate. He was to become a future Bayview Lake captain himself in the years ahead, and at the time of this rescue was also a Bayview neighbour of his captain on this ship, George Thompson. At the time of this event, George was living at 447 East Lincoln Avenue with his wife and 2 children, while Brownell was living at 515 East Ocean Street with his wife and several young children. Finally, with everyone else successfully ashore, it was time to take the last man off, the ship's captain. The life-saving team on the pier winched the Breeches Buoy out to the ship one more time for Captain George Thompson to climb into. Once inside the buoy, he gave the shore crew a thumbs up, held on to the ropes holding his seat, and they pulled him ashore. This is the only documented Breeches Buoy rescue of a Bayview Lake captain, and in this case, there is even a photograph of it taking place. It may also have been one of the largest Breeches Buoy rescues ever in the Great Lakes history, considering at least a couple hundred people had to be hauled ashore. However, this is not known. While George Thompson is the only Bayview Lake captain to be officially documented as having been rescued with the Breeches Buoy, it's likely other Bayview Lake captains, to include Captains Frank Richardson Sr. and Thomas Leask, among others, were also to be saved by the buoy. However, these are not officially confirmed. And so, this was a case of two Bayview neighbours who were serving on the same ship that were saved by the same legendary rescue system over on the other side of Lake Michigan. At this point, a short time out will be taken from George Thompson's biography in order to discuss and explain exactly what a Breeches Buoy rescue apparatus was and how it worked. Simply defined, if a ship during this era of the late 19th and early 20th centuries was in distress and spotted from the shore, the US Lifesaving Service had two ways it could rescue the crew. First, if the ship was further offshore and within range of the life-saving station, a small boat would be launched down the station ramp into the water, if such a ramp existed, or the boat would be towed out of the station by horses and taken down to the surf. Men from the station would then man the oars and row out to the stranded ship to get the crew off that way. Second, if the ship was close enough to shore, the Breeches Buoy could be used to bring the crew off. This method also required the ship in distress to be somewhat close to the station, in order for the horses to pull the entire Breeches Buoy apparatus to the beach, so the buoy could be sent out to the ship and back. This was done by launching a piece of very long rope out to the ship, using a small cannon called a Lyle gun. The crew would catch it and tie it to one of the ship's masts. The rope, tied now to both the ship's mast and the elevated life-saving station's shore apparatus on the beach that had been brought in by the horses, now created an elevated zip line above the wire that a kind of safety chair, called the Breeches Buoy, could be hung on, and then, using pulleys, sent back and forth from the ship, bringing one crewman to safety each time. It was this second method of rescue described above, the Breeches Buoy system, that the US Lifesaving Station crew in Ludington, Michigan, successfully employed to get all the passengers, crew, second mate, and future Bayview Lake captain and neighbour Stephen Brownell, as well as its captain, Bayview's George L. Thompson, off of the sinking Père Marquette No. 16, shortly before Christmas in 1901. Again, here is the photograph of this actual rescue taking place. After the rescue, the Père Marquette No. 16 was later raised and sailing again in 1902, with George Thompson continuing as its captain. He also left Bayview this same year, never to return. Late in 1902, not long before he left Bayview, he became a victim of a serious accident. He had to have his foot amputated after it got run over by either a railroad car or possibly a streetcar on South Kinnickinnick Avenue on the way to the car ferry pier opposite Jones Island. But, typical of most lake captains of the time, Thompson didn't let this stop him. He merely had an artificial foot installed, and just kept on sailing. George continued as the Père Marquette No. 16's captain through at least the winter of 1906. All told, George Thompson captained the Shenango No. 2, Muskegon, Père Marquette No. 16, for a total of 9 years, from 1897 to 1906. Sometime later, in the year 1906, George became captain of the Père Marquette No. 20. However, this is the last information discovered about him. Nothing more is heard of him, except for a cryptic listing in a news report in the Calgary Tribune of November 1918 that simply states, "Perished in sinking, 1914. But was it indeed him? There were many George Thompsons. He had a Canadian connection, so that fits, but what was the name of the ship that sank? This would help nail down that it was him. but without that there is no way to confirm it was our George Thompson. Searches for a possible grave site have proved inconclusive. Where he went, beginning in 1907, and how he died, is a mystery. George Thompson married wife Edith R. Flood in Detroit on 3 December 1881. They had 3 children. William and Hazel were both born in Michigan. A third child apparently died as a child. On 16th July 1898, George's only son, William, aged 16, was reported missing by his mother. At the time, they were living at 2254 South Alice Street in Bayview, and, at the time of his son being reported missing, George was in Muskegon as captain of the car ferry Shenango No. 2. William would be found 3 days later, when he walked in the front door of the family home. It turns out that he and 3 friends had sailed the sailing yacht Dove Eye, owned by someone else, north to Port Washington, and gotten stuck in a storm several miles out on Lake Michigan. Luckily, they got close enough to shore so that when the rudder broke, the wind blew them ashore on a sandy beach near Whitefish Bay. William then walked home to Bayview. Thanks for watching. This photograph isn't about Bayview or its lake captains, but it's from the same era of Great Lakes maritime history. We thought we'd close with it for enjoyment, as it captures the spirit of the era. If you'd like to read more details about Captain George L. Thompson, as well as the sources for the information contained in today's video, you can find these and more in the book Bayview, Town of Lake Captains, for sale now, by individual volumes on both Amazon.com and HenschelHouseBooks.com. All proceeds from book sales go to support various maritime history projects related to Bayview's lake captains. One of these is a plaque and marker with the captains' names and addresses on it, as part of the creation of the Bayview Lake Captains Historic District, which will be the first of its kind in America. If you would like to contribute to support these projects, to include this and other markers honouring Bayview's lake captains, with 100% of all donations and contributions in all forms going to support them, please consider contributing to us through the listings found on our website under the Contribute button, as well as in the end credits at the conclusion of this video. Note, we are not a 501c3, so contributions are not tax-deductible. If, for some reason, we are unable to secure these markers, then all funds donated to this site will be given as a cash donation to the museum ship SS City of Milwaukee in Manistee, Michigan. This is the only surviving intact ship that was once captained by a Bayview lake captain, and in its case was captained by at least 2, and likely 3, totaling over 20 years between them. Finally, we also have free self-guided walking tours of Bayview's 71 lake captains' homes, using only your phone. It's simple and easy. Just go to our website shown here, find the item on the menu bar at the upper left named Free Self-Guided Walking Tours, and then scroll down to find the map with the instructions. Zoom in by street. When you find a captain's house you're interested in, click on it and details appear on the right, along with a link to the YouTube episode from this channel that provides the biography of the captain that lived there. It's free, fun, and available any time you are out walking. Just bring along your phone. I'm Simon Stanhope, narrator for these episodes. Join us again soon for the next chapter of Bayview, Town of Lake Captains.